Hey everyone, Tony is here again with you tonight. I hope you've dimmed the lights, settled somewhere comfortable, maybe with a blanket, maybe with a cup of tea. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I always love to imagine these stories traveling out across the world. Someone in a quiet apartment in Bangkok, someone else in a cottage in Yorkshire, maybe someone in a dorm room in New York, earbuds in, drifting toward sleep while history does what it always does, repeat itself, only with slightly worse costumes. Let me know down in the comments. It helps me picture where you are, and it makes this quiet little journey feel a little less lonely. Now, tonight's drift through the past takes us to Renaissance Rome, and specifically to one man, Rodrigo Borgia, or as he preferred to be known after 1492, Pope Alexander VI. A man who took the holiest palace in Europe and, quite sincerely, turned it into something resembling a brothel. Yes, that's not exaggeration, not satire. That is the reputation he earned. And to be honest, he didn't seem to mind. If anything, he leaned into it. When people imagine popes, they picture men of piety, fasting, praying, keeping their vows, maybe looking a bit severe in frescoes. But Rodrigo was none of these things. He was charming, indulgent, ambitious, and shameless. He bribed his way into the papacy, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, and hosted feasts that were less holy gatherings than carnival shows with silk, wine, and women who were decidedly not nuns. And at the height of it all, he presided over a night now remembered, somewhat ridiculously, as the Banquet of Chestnuts, a spectacle of courtesans crawling on marble floors while cardinals watched. We'll get there eventually, but tonight we'll ease into it slowly, like wading into a warm bath you know is faintly dirty, but still oddly comforting. Let's drift back first to Rome in the late 1400s. Imagine approaching the city after weeks on the road, the sun setting over broken ruins, the silhouette of St. Peter's dome not yet finished, the air carrying the smell of wood smoke, sewage, and roasting meat. The Rome of Alexander's time was not the Rome of Caesar, polished in marble and echoing with triumph. It was a half-ruined place. Goats grazing in the forum, noble families squatting in crumbling palaces, and pilgrims trudging through mud to kiss relics and buy indulgences. The city lived both in the shadow of its ancient grandeur and in the bright, crooked light of Renaissance ambition. And in this setting, Rodrigo Borgia thrived. Born in Spain, imported to Rome by his uncle when the family got lucky with one of their own becoming pope, Rodrigo slid effortlessly into the role of cardinal. He had charm, money, and the kind of broad-shouldered presence that made people take notice. Where other men cloaked themselves in vows, Rodrigo saw them as technicalities, celibacy, a nice suggestion, humility, a useful disguise, but not for him. He collected mistresses the way others collected relics, and his children were not hidden away in monasteries, but proudly acknowledged, raised like heirs to a throne that was never supposed to exist. And this is what makes his story so strange and so compelling. He did not invent corruption in the papacy. There had been plenty of bad popes before him, but he embodied it with such openness, such lack of shame that even Renaissance Romans, who were hardly naive, found themselves both scandalized and entertained. When pilgrims arrived in Rome, they expected holiness, incense, monks chanting in quiet chapels. Instead, they found cardinals stumbling out of banquets, Alexander's teenage son strutting through the streets in gold armor, and his daughter glittering in jewels on her way to yet another arranged marriage. It must have been confusing. Imagine walking barefoot for months to kiss the ring of Christ's vicar, only to find that the vicar was busy organizing chestnut-related entertainment. But that was Rodrigo Borgia's papacy in a nutshell. Power mixed with spectacle, faith tangled with indulgence, holiness bent into something more profitable and entertaining. His court was not so much a religious sanctuary as a Renaissance household, complete with feasts, mistresses, political marriages, and scandals whispered across Europe. And yet, despite the outrage, he remained firmly in place, unshaken, unembarrassed, and entirely in control. Tonight, as we wander through his story, we won't rush to the scandals just yet. We'll take our time, letting the details drift in slowly. The candle-lit halls, the velvet drapery, the sound of laughter where there should have been prayer. The man himself, smiling that easy Spanish smile, shaking hands with one cardinal while slipping bribes to another. Rodrigo Borgia, who would become Pope Alexander VI, the shepherd of souls who behaved less like a saint and more like a man who had confused the Vatican with a pleasure palace. So settle in, wherever you are listening. Imagine the flicker of torches on frescoed walls, the rustle of silk, the heavy scent of wine and incense mingling in the air. Tonight, we begin the story of the Pope who turned the Vatican into a brothel. And like all good stories at bedtime, it will be equal parts absurd, scandalous, and gently lulling, a reminder that history is always stranger than we expect, and usually funnier too. Before he became Pope Alexander VI, the scandalous host of chestnut banquets and the man whose name would become synonymous with corruption, Rodrigo Borgia was just another ambitious cleric in a world where ambition was the only true qualification. He was born in 1431 in Zativa, a small town in the Kingdom of Valencia, then part of the Crown of Aragon. The Borgias or Borgias, as they were known in Spain, were wealthy and ambitious, but they were hardly destined for eternal notoriety. What changed everything was family. For Rodrigo's uncle was Alfonso de Borgia, a clever and cautious churchman who rose through the ranks and, in 1455, became Pope Calixtus III. And like all good Renaissance uncles, he did what any newly powerful relative would do. He handed out jobs to the family. Rodrigo, handsome, clever, and 24 years old, was made a cardinal. In other words, the path to Rome's highest circles was opened for him before he had even had a chance to pretend to be holy. As a cardinal, Rodrigo discovered that the church was less a sanctuary for prayer and more a labyrinth of politics. In theory, his role demanded chastity, humility, and dedication. In practice, it demanded charm, money, and the ability to make useful promises. Rodrigo had all three. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and striking, with a smile that could win friends and lovers alike. He was organized, shrewd, and skilled at managing church finances. But above all, he had the ability to make men feel important and women feel desired. He carried himself not as a cloistered priest, but as a courtier. His vow of celibacy was treated more like a polite suggestion, one he rarely followed and never felt guilty about ignoring. Mistresses became as regular a part of his life as banquets. He did not bother to conceal them. Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman of wealth and elegance, was not simply a passing dalliance. She was the mother of 4 of his children, who would later define the Borgia dynasty: Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Other lovers followed, and other children as well, But it was Vanozza's brood who would carry the Borgia name into both legend and infamy. Rome, of course, gossiped endlessly. But in a city where most cardinals kept mistresses, Rodrigo's sins were less unusual than the fact that he flaunted them so openly. Ambition carried him higher. For decades he worked his way through the church hierarchy, building alliances, managing money, and dispensing bribes with practiced ease. He served as vice-chancellor of the papacy, a position that gave him immense influence and a steady flow of gold. He built networks of loyalty and obligation, buying support with coin, offices, and favors. He was tireless, always watching for the opportunity to climb higher. And when the papal throne fell vacant in 1492, Rodrigo was ready. The election of a pope was supposed to be a solemn process of prayer and discernment. In reality, it resembled a particularly expensive auction. Cardinals gathered, not so much to seek divine inspiration as to compare offers. Rodrigo was the master bidder. He promised estates, bishoprics, palaces, gold, anything that would secure a vote. One contemporary remarked that half the College of Cardinals could have furnished a small shop with the treasures they received. And so, after sufficient bribery had greased sufficient hands, Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious. On August 11, 1492, he was proclaimed Pope Alexander VI. If anyone in Rome was surprised, they did not show it. Everyone knew how he had won, and everyone knew what sort of man he was. Some chroniclers muttered that he had bought the papacy like one might buy a horse. Others sighed that Rome had been given not a shepherd of souls, but a Spaniard with too many children. But Alexander himself felt no shame. He had achieved his life's ambition, and if his methods had been unorthodox, well, so had everyone else's. He simply happened to be better at it. What followed was not a transformation into holiness, but the continuation of Rodrigo's life on a grander scale. As Pope, he became not a humble servant of Christ, but the head of a dynasty. He openly acknowledged his children, showered them with titles, and married them into powerful families. He welcomed mistresses into his Vatican apartments. He decorated his halls, not with the austere symbols of faith, but with the trappings of power and luxury. He ruled not as St. Peter's successor, but as the patriarch of the Borgias, turning the Vatican into a family estate. For the faithful who had trudged across Europe to kiss the Pope's ring, the sight of his daughter glittering in jewels or his son swaggering in golden armor must have been disorienting. Pilgrims had expected solemnity. What they found instead was a court that looked suspiciously like any other Renaissance court, complete with mistresses, airs, banquets, and intrigues. The only difference was that this one happened to wear the robes of the papacy. Alexander VI was not without political skill. He maneuvered among the powers of Italy, balancing the ambitions of France, Spain, and the Italian city-states. He strengthened the papal states, built alliances, and advanced his children's fortunes. But these achievements were overshadowed, even in his own time, by his shameless indulgence. The papacy had seen corruption before, but never so brazenly displayed. Rome's satirists and pamphleteers had a field day, mocking the Pope who preferred banquets to prayers and mistresses to sermons. The nickname "the Pope who turned the Vatican into a brothel" began to stick. By the time the year 1500 dawned, Alexander had established his court as a place of opulence, rumor, and scandal. And it was from within this atmosphere that the most notorious event of his reign would emerge. The evening when cardinals gathered not for solemn liturgy but to watch courtesans scramble for chestnuts across the papal floor. The night that would ensure his name lingered forever as the very embodiment of papal corruption. But before that torchlit banquet, it is worth pausing to understand the man himself. Rodrigo Borgia was not unique in his sins. What made him unforgettable was his refusal to apologize for them. He did not hide his children. He did not veil his mistresses. He did not pretend to be what he was not. He lived openly, greedily, ambitiously, and he carried that same shameless energy onto the throne of St. Peter. And perhaps that is why history remembers him so vividly. It is not the hidden sins that haunt us, but the ones committed in plain sight. If Rodrigo Borgia's papacy resembled anything, it was less a sacred office and more a family dynasty with velvet curtains pulled clumsily over the scandals. The vows of celibacy that he had technically taken as a churchman remained in his life about as firmly as a draught through an open window. He ignored them, openly, shamelessly, and without apology. His mistresses were not hidden in shadowy corners, but acknowledged, celebrated, and even used to advance his influence. And his children, instead of being quietly tucked away in convents, were paraded like heirs in a royal court, their lives woven into the papal strategy with a brazenness that made even jaded Renaissance Romans raise their eyebrows. The most enduring of his early companions was Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman with wealth, refinement, and just enough aristocratic bearing to make the match convenient. She was not the fleeting sort of lover whispered about in alleys. She was stable, established, and the mother of 4 of Rodrigo's children, who would go on to play starring roles in the family's extraordinary rise and notorious fall. These children, Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Giuffre, were the beating heart of the Borgia story. And from the moment they were born, they were less children than pawns, pieces on a chessboard that Rodrigo moved across the map of Italy with cold determination. Cesare was the most infamous of the brood. Handsome, intelligent, and almost ferociously ambitious, he was raised first for the church. Rodrigo had him made a cardinal at 18, which was hardly an age for guiding Christendom. But then again, Christendom had not been Rodrigo's concern for a long time. Cesare looked splendid in scarlet robes, but his spirit was never meant for altars. He longed for swords, for horses, for battlefields. Eventually, he abandoned his cardinal's hat to become a warlord, leading papal armies in a campaign that carved out whole territories for himself. Ruthless, charismatic, admired by some, feared by nearly everyone, he moved like a storm across the Italian countryside. Machiavelli, watching from Florence, admired him so much that he later used Cesare as the living model for the prince, his notorious manual on how to seize and keep power. It was an odd legacy for the son of a pope, but then again, odd legacies were what the Borgias specialized in. Giovanni, the eldest, was given wealth and titles, becoming Duke of Gandia. If Cesare was sharp like a blade, Giovanni was duller, a handsome figure more suited to banquets than battlefields. In 1497, he vanished one summer evening after leaving a dinner party. Days later, his body surfaced in the Tiber River, stabbed and dumped with casual brutality. Rome buzzed with rumors about who had killed him. Some blamed political rivals. Others whispered Cesare had arranged his own brother's death out of jealousy. Nothing was ever proven, but the suspicion clung tightly. The Pope, devastated and furious, launched an investigation, but the city kept its silence. In the end, Giovanni's body was lowered into the ground, and the questions sank with him. Lucrezia, Rodrigo's daughter, became the most infamous of all, though much of her reputation came not from fact, but from the eager pens of her family's enemies. Blonde, cultured, and admired for her grace, she was used again and again as a diplomatic pawn. Rodrigo married her off 3 times, each union a new attempt to secure alliances. Wherever she went, whispers followed. Was she a poisoner with a hollow ring designed to slip fatal powders into her enemies' cups? Was she her father's mistress or her brother's lover? None of these stories were ever proven, and most were the invention of rival families determined to blacken her name. But in the gossipy climate of Renaissance Rome, proof was hardly necessary. The rumors stuck, and Lucrezia was immortalized less as a duchess than as a scandal, her image forever entwined with venom and seduction. In truth, she spent much of her life maneuvering carefully within the traps set for her, raising children, managing courts, and in her later years establishing herself as a respected Duchess of Ferrara. But Rome preferred the scandalous Lucrezia, and scandal is always more enduring than truth. The youngest son, Geoffrey, lived in the shadow of his siblings. Married off young to a princess of Naples, he was less a player in the great drama than a footnote. While Cesare carved territories and Lucrezia endured rumor, Geoffrey occupied himself quietly, his life marked more by survival than brilliance. Perhaps it was a mercy. In a family so entangled in intrigue, anonymity could be its own protection. As Vanozza faded from Rodrigo's life, another mistress appeared, Giulia Farnese, called Giulia la Bella. She was young, luminous, and so publicly acknowledged as Rodrigo's companion that Romans dubbed her the Pope's bride. She lived within Vatican walls, strolling freely where pilgrims expected to see only monks and priests. Scandalous, of course. But scandal had long since become ordinary in the papal palace. Her brother, Alessandro Farnese, riding the wave of her influence, was advanced by Rodrigo in church offices. In time, Alessandro would become Pope Paul III, which meant that Giulia, once mocked as the Pope's mistress, indirectly became the sister of a pontiff. In the Borgia world, disgrace and advancement often walked hand in hand. The presence of mistresses and children within the Vatican walls transformed the papal palace into something less like a monastery and more like a noble estate. Servants bustled, preparing dowries, managing feasts, tending to the needs of Rodrigo's brood. Guards stood at doors, not just to protect holy relics, but to defend his heirs. Courtiers whispered about marriage alliances and inheritances rather than theology. The sacred and the secular were so thoroughly entangled that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Romans watched with fascination. For some, it was shocking. For others, it was entertaining. The gossip spilled out of the Vatican like wine down a cracked goblet. Who had Rodrigo favored this week? What new title had been handed to one of his sons? Was Lucrezia's smile as innocent as it appeared? Or did it hide a vial of poison? The truth mattered less than the whispers, and in the theaters of rumor, the Borgias were stars. This was what made Alexander VI so remarkable. Other popes had lovers, other popes had children. But Rodrigo was the one who flaunted them, who seemed to revel in their presence, who paraded his dynasty as though it were not shameful, but glorious. He was not content to be pope in the traditional sense. He wanted to be the founder of a house, a name etched into history, a family as enduring as the Medicis or the Sforzas. That he used the throne of St. Peter as his springboard only added to the outrage. By the turn of the century, the Vatican had become a family fortress. The corridors echoed not with hymns, but with the footsteps of children, the laughter of courtesans, and the murmurs of political plots. Alexander did not hide it. He ruled with open nepotism, turning the papacy into a private inheritance. For Romans, it was a spectacle. For enemies of the Borgias, it was proof of corruption. For history, it was unforgettable. And it was this very openness, this brazen flaunting of family over faith, that set the stage for the most infamous night of all, the evening when the Holy Palace played host not to prayers or psalms, but to courtesans crawling for chestnuts while cardinals watched. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not an accident, not a deviation from the norm. It was the natural climax of everything Rodrigo had built, a papacy less sacred than theatrical, less a church than a stage for family ambition and desire. As the torches were lit in that autumn of 1501, the whispers of scandal grew louder, preparing to burst into legend, and the Borgias, with their mistresses and children, their banquets and intrigues, seemed only too willing to provide the world with more stories than it could ever finish telling. If there was ever a single night that captured everything about Alexander VI's papacy, it was the one later whispered across Europe as the Banquet of Chestnuts. Even the name sounds faintly ridiculous, as though it were some rustic harvest festival gone wrong. But what took place that October evening in 1501 inside the Apostolic Palace was less rural feast and more theatrical scandal, one that cemented the Borgias forever in history's imagination. The accounts say the hall glowed with torches, shadows flickering against frescoed walls that had been painted to honor saints and martyrs, but on this night watched silently over something altogether different. Long tables bent under the weight of roasted meats, mountains of fruit, sculpted sugar confections, and golden cups overflowing with wine. Guests were not humble pilgrims or weary monks, but cardinals, nobles, and courtiers, their red robes and jeweled collars catching the torchlight. Among them moved another group entirely, dozens of courtesans. Women who had no business inside the Vatican, but who were welcomed all the same, their laughter echoing through corridors that had once been built for prayer. At first, it seemed a feast like many others. The Renaissance papal court was already known for indulgence, and Rome was no stranger to banquets. But, as the night went on, the entertainment took a turn that would stain Alexander's reputation forever. According to the papal master of ceremonies, Johann Burchard, whose unfortunate duty it was to observe and record such things, chestnuts were scattered across the polished marble floor after the meal. The courtesans, stripped of most of their garments, were ordered to crawl on hands and knees, gathering the nuts as cardinals and noblemen looked on. It was part contest, part spectacle, part cruel parody of innocence. The guests roared with laughter, while the women scrambled beneath the tables, their bodies gleaming in the firelight. Burchard, in his dry and weary manner, wrote of what happened with the air of a man who had seen far too much. He noted that prizes were offered, silks, jewels, and favors for those who performed with the most skill. To put it gently, the contest did not end at chestnuts. The women were encouraged to show their talents in other ways, with cardinals and attendants participating enthusiastically. It was, in every way, a brothel masquerading as a papal feast, a night in which vows of chastity were forgotten as quickly as spilled wine. Was the Pope himself present, watching with amused detachment, or was he directly involved? Historians argue still. Some suggest Rodrigo merely hosted and observed. Others believe he joined more actively, while a few insist his enemies exaggerated the entire story. But the truth, in a way, doesn't matter. The fact that it was believable was damning enough. Alexander had so consistently blurred the line between piety and indulgence that no rumor seemed too far-fetched. If people heard that chestnuts were scattered on Vatican floors while half-dressed courtesans crawled after them, they did not cry out, "Impossible." They sighed. Of course he did. The symbolism was too perfect to ignore. Chestnuts, humble and earthy, reduced to toys in a debased game, mirrored the church itself under Alexander, sacred in theory, humiliated in practice. Cardinals, meant to be guardians of faith, watched from gilded chairs as if at a private circus. And the Pope, the vicar of Christ, presided over a spectacle that mocked everything his office was meant to represent. It was less a feast than a declaration of power, a reminder that Alexander could turn the holiest palace in Europe into his own playground and face no consequences. Naturally, news of the banquet spread. Rome's gossip mills thrived on it. Pamphleteers carried the tale across the Alps, where reformers eagerly used it as proof of Rome's decay. In Germany, Martin Luther would later point to stories like this as evidence that the church was rotten. Satirists painted the Vatican not as the throne of God's vicar, but as a carnival house where priests laughed over wine while souls starved. Whether every detail was true mattered less than the fact that the story fit perfectly with what everyone already suspected. Still, there is room for doubt. Burchard's account remains the only direct source, and while he was a meticulous recorder of papal ceremonies, he was also a man who served more than one master. Was his description entirely accurate, or did he sharpen it under the influence of those who despised the Borgias? We cannot know. What we do know is that enemies of the Borgias seized on the tale with glee, repeating it until it became legend. The Banquet of Chestnuts became shorthand for the corruption of the Renaissance papacy, a story repeated so often that it ceased to matter whether it had happened precisely as told. The ordinary people of Rome, of course, did not witness the spectacle firsthand, but they heard about it soon enough. In taverns and markets, the whispers spread. Pilgrims who had come seeking holiness shook their heads in disbelief. Preachers thundered about sin from the pulpit, and yet life in the city carried on. Rome had long grown accustomed to scandal. If Alexander's papacy was a river of corruption, the banquet was simply one more ripple on its surface. Outrage was tempered by resignation. This was, after all, the Borgia era. And so the night faded into memory, torches burned down to ash, and the chestnuts were swept away by servants. The courtesans left the palace with whatever prizes they had been promised. The cardinals returned to their chapels, and Alexander continued his reign as though nothing unusual had happened. But the whispers remained. They lodged themselves in the memory of Rome, passed from tongue to tongue, growing sharper with every retelling. In the centuries that followed, The Banquet of Chestnuts would come to define Alexander VI more than his political maneuvers, more than his patronage of art, more even than the wars of his ambitious son. When his name was spoken, it was not treaties or frescoes that people remembered, but chestnuts on marble floors, crawling courtesans, and a pope who turned the Vatican into a brothel. It may not be fair. It may not even be entirely true. But history has a way of choosing its symbols, and in this case, it chose chestnuts scattered beneath the feet of priests. A detail absurd enough, humiliating enough, unforgettable enough to last. And so, when we think of Alexander VI today, we think less of his decrees or his alliances, and more of that one night in Rome. A night when the holiest palace in Europe blurred into a stage for vice, when rumor and reality entwined so tightly that they became indistinguishable. A night that lingered like smoke long after the torches went out. Outside the Vatican's glittering halls, life in Rome under Alexander VI had a rhythm far different from the torchlit banquets and whispered scandals of the papal palace. To step into the streets was to enter a city caught between glory and decay, a place where the ruins of empire lay scattered among the huts of the poor, and where faith and corruption lived side by side as naturally as shadows and light. Rome was not the marble city of Caesar anymore. By the late 15th century, it looked more like a broken stage set. The Colosseum, once roaring with gladiators, had been stripped for building materials. Columns of the ancient Forum stood like tired teeth in a ruined jaw, surrounded by grazing goats. Families squatted in crumbling palaces, cooking their meals in corners once draped in silk. Pilgrims arriving after months on the road often expected a heavenly city. But what they found instead was a mixture of poverty, ruin, and opportunism. The Vatican rose above it all, dazzling with frescoes and treasures, but for those outside its gates, life was smoke, mud, and survival. Pilgrims still came by the thousands. They trudged across Europe, barefoot and blistered, clutching rosaries and prayers, hoping that in Rome they would find holiness. Many left disappointed. They discovered that indulgences, those spiritual pardons from punishment in the afterlife, were sold for cash like bread in a market stall. Priests who were supposed to guide souls offered absolution with one hand and extended the other for payment. One German traveler returned home and wrote that Rome was a place where holiness drowned in wine, and priests were less pious than butchers. For every candle-lit mass that moved a pilgrim to tears, there was a clerk loudly demanding coin for the privilege. Corruption was not hidden. It was the very air the city breathed. A lawsuit could be won not with evidence, but with the right bribe. A bishopric could be bought if one's purse was heavy enough. Even monasteries bent with the times. Stories spread of abbots living with mistresses, monks gambling in taverns, and nuns conveniently turning a blind eye if the price was right. And at the center of this economy of sin sat Alexander VI himself, a pope whose court functioned more like a royal household than a holy one. His papacy was less about guiding souls and more about orchestrating alliances, managing mistresses, and watching his children climb like ivy up the walls of Italian politics. For ordinary Romans, life went on. They endured disease, food shortages, and streets thick with refuse, but they also had front-row seats to one of history's most scandalous theaters. They could watch Cesare Borgia ride through the city in golden armor, his entourage glittering like a small army. They could gape at Lucrezia's wedding processions, which wound through the streets with carriages of silk and music. A spectacle designed to remind everyone that the Pope's daughter was not just a bride, but a political weapon. On one day they might beg for bread, and the next they might watch fireworks explode above the Vatican, illuminating the night sky as though Rome itself were trying to distract them from its crumbling stones. And of course, there was the gossip. Rome thrived on it. Markets buzzed with speculation about who had been poisoned, who had been seduced, and who had mysteriously disappeared after crossing a Borgia. The family's enemies delighted in spreading tales of incest and murder, and even those who doubted them could not resist repeating the stories. One of the city's favorite traditions was the Pasquinade, anonymous verses pasted to the statue of Pasquino near Piazza Navona, mocking the Pope and his children in rhymes. It was the Renaissance version of anonymous internet posts, and the Borgias were constant targets. No amount of gilded armor or pearl necklaces could protect them from the sharp wit of Rome's satirists. And yet, despite all of this, religion did not vanish. Pilgrims still knelt before relics. Priests still intoned the Mass. Monks still chanted in candlelit choirs. The rituals carried on, solemn and beautiful, even as those performing them whispered about mistresses and bribes. Faith endured because people needed it, even if the institution delivering it was rotting. To the weary traveler or the desperate peasant, the holy water still felt holy, no matter what rumors said about the Pope who blessed it. But there is no denying the contradiction. Rome in Alexander VI's time was both profoundly religious and profoundly corrupt. It was a city where barefoot peasants shuffled to kiss the Pope's ring while the Pope's mistress strolled past in silk slippers. It was a city where priests preached chastity from pulpits and hurried off afterward to the arms of lovers. It was a city where sacred chants echoed in basilicas, while chestnuts were scattered on the floor of papal banquets. The sacred and the profane existed not in opposition, but side by side, like two voices singing in disharmony, each too loud to drown the other out. This tension did not go unnoticed. It festered. Alexander VI may not have lived to see the Protestant Reformation, but his papacy gave men like Martin Luther every reason to believe the Church had lost its way. Less than 20 years after Rodrigo Borgia died, Europe would be split by reformers who pointed to the very scandals of his reign as proof of Rome's corruption. The irony was bitter. In trying to raise his family higher than any before, Alexander had helped prepare the ground for a movement that would tear the authority of popes apart. Still, in the quiet of the city streets, life continued in its ordinary rhythm. Children chased one another in the ruins of the Forum. Merchants shouted over prices in crowded markets. Pilgrims trudged onward, clutching their rosaries with hope, and above them all, the Vatican glittered with frescoes and banquets, a palace both admired and despised. For those who lived in Rome, the papacy was not some distant abstraction. It was the neighbor who held feasts while you went hungry, the landlord who demanded rent with one hand while scattering coins with the other, the ruler who was both sacred and profane in the same breath. This was Rome under Alexander VI, a city of contrasts where misery and magnificence walked hand in hand, a city where faith survived even as trust crumbled, a city where, outside the Vatican walls, barefoot pilgrims shuffled in the mud, while inside, cardinals drank wine and courtesans danced. And perhaps that is why his reign remains unforgettable, not because it was uniquely corrupt, but because it embodied the contradiction of the age so perfectly. By the dawn of the 16th century, the Borgias seemed untouchable. They had transformed the papacy into a family business, paraded their children through the streets of Rome like princes, and scandalized all of Europe with their shamelessness. Yet even in their moment of triumph, cracks were spreading beneath the marble floors of the Vatican. No family could burn so brightly without eventually collapsing into ash. It began, as such things often do, with ambition. Cesare Borgia, Alexander's brilliant and ruthless son, was carving his way across Italy with sword in hand. He had abandoned the red robes of a cardinal to don armor, and he did it with such ferocity that entire regions bent to his will. Fortresses fell, rival families crumbled, and the name Borgia carried the weight of fear wherever it was spoken. Machiavelli himself admired Cesare, writing that he was the model of what a ruler should be: cunning, bold, and utterly without scruple. But admiration in theory does not guarantee success in practice. Cesare's rise was swift, but it depended entirely on his father's power. Without Alexander in the papal chair, he was just another ambitious warlord in a land already crowded with them. The family's troubles were not confined to Cesare's battlefields. Giovanni Borgia, the eldest son, had already been murdered years earlier, his body pulled from the Tiber with stab wounds too numerous to count. Whispers blamed Cesare, though nothing was proven. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was married off again and again, her life spent as a pawn in her father's diplomatic chess matches. Each marriage brought her into new intrigues, each one left behind a trail of rumors. She was called poisoner, seductress, and worse, though most of those stories came from the pens of enemies eager to smear the family name. Still, in the gossip-saturated world of Rome, the truth hardly mattered. Alexander himself, meanwhile, grew older, but no wiser. His papacy continued in its familiar style: banquets, bribes, and bold indulgence. By 1503, however, time was catching up with him. The Pope, who had once seemed untouchable, began to falter. That summer, Rome was struck by a wave of disease, likely malaria, carried by mosquitoes from the marshes around the city. Death crept quietly through the streets, sparing no palace or hovel. In August, Alexander VI fell ill after attending a banquet with Cesare. The timing was suspicious enough that rumors of poisoning immediately spread. Some whispered that enemies had slipped venom into the wine. Others claimed that father and son had accidentally poisoned themselves while trying to poison a guest. In reality, it was almost certainly malaria, but history has never been fond of boring explanations. And in a way, poisoning fit the Borgia legend too neatly to discard. Alexander's condition worsened rapidly. The strong, broad-shouldered Spaniard who had once charmed and bullied his way into the papacy was reduced to a feverish wreck. Sweating and gasping in the Vatican, witnesses wrote that his face turned dark, his body bloated, and his death was agonizing. For a man who had lived so publicly, it was a grim and unflattering end. He died on August 18, 1503, at the age of 72. The reaction in Rome was swift and unkind. Where some popes were mourned, Alexander was not. Crowds gathered outside the Vatican, not to grieve, but to gawk. His body, laid out for viewing, was described by witnesses as grotesque, swollen, discolored, and barely recognizable. People muttered that it was a fitting end for such a corrupt man. as though the decay of his corpse was divine justice made visible. Even in death, Rodrigo Borgia scandalized Rome. With his father gone, Cesare's empire crumbled almost overnight. He had built his power entirely on papal backing, and without Alexander's hand on the levers of influence, his enemies pounced. The cardinals quickly elected a new pope, Julius II, who was no friend of the Borgias. Cesare tried to hold his territories together, but he was sick himself from the same fever that had killed his father. Weakened, betrayed, and suddenly without allies, he was forced into retreat. Over the next 2 years, Cesare's fortunes collapsed. He was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually exiled. Stripped of power, he wandered Europe as a shadow of the warlord he had once been. In 1507, at the age of 31, Cesare was killed in battle in Spain, his body left on the field, stripped of armor and dignity. For a man who had dreamed of conquering half of Italy, it was a small and bitter ending. Lucrezia, perhaps the most maligned of the Borgia children, outlived them all. After her father's death, she settled into her role as Duchess of Ferrara through her marriage to Alfonso d'Este. Away from Rome's poisonous gossip, she remade herself as a respectable noblewoman. She became a patron of the arts, presiding over a court that attracted poets, scholars, and musicians. In Ferrara, she was remembered not as a poisoner or seductress, but as a cultured duchess who supported learning and piety. Still, the rumors never fully left her. History preferred the scandalous version of Lucrezia to the real one. She died in 1519, aged 39, worn down by multiple pregnancies, her life shaped more by the ambitions of others than by her own choices. As for the Borgia name, it lingered as a byword for corruption and excess. Their enemies made sure of that. Pamphleteers, reformers, and rival families spread tales of incest, poison, and sin until the line between fact and fiction blurred. Some of the stories were true. Many were not. But in the popular imagination, the Borgias became symbols of everything wrong with the church, and perhaps that was their most lasting legacy. Alexander VI had ruled during the very years when dissatisfaction with Rome was growing. His banquets, his bribes, his chestnut-scattering scandals, all of it fed the sense that the papacy had lost its way. Less than 2 decades after his death, Martin Luther would rise, hammering his complaints to a church door in Wittenberg, and the Protestant Reformation would explode across Europe. Reformers needed examples of corruption to rally against, and the Borgias provided them in abundance. In the end, the House of Borgia fell not with a bang, but with a series of withering sighs. A pope dead of fever, a warlord's son slain in exile, a daughter remembered more for rumors than truth. The dynasty that had once terrified Italy dissolved into history's cautionary tale, and yet their story still clings to us centuries later because it contains everything we secretly expect from history at its most decadent: power, ambition, scandal, downfall. So as we drift away from the ruins of their empire, we can leave Rodrigo Borgia where he belongs. In his Vatican palace, torchlight flickering, courtesans laughing, cardinals watching, chestnuts rolling across marble. A pope who turned the holiest palace in Europe into a stage for his family's ambitions, and who discovered, too late, that even the richest banquets cannot buy eternity. History is rarely kind to those who live too brightly. The Borgias burned across the stage of Renaissance Europe with scandal, ambition, and excess so vivid that even centuries later, their shadows still linger. When people speak of corruption, of nepotism, of power abused, the name Borgia still drifts like a ghost across the conversation. It has become shorthand, almost a curse. And yet, as with most legends, the truth is both more complicated and far less sensational than the whispers suggest. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, was not the only pope to have mistresses. He was not the only pope to have children, nor the only one to turn the papacy into a family enterprise. But he was the one who made no effort to hide it, who leaned into his appetite so openly that even jaded Rome gasped. In an age when appearances mattered, Rodrigo dispensed with appearances entirely. He was brazen, and brazen men make lasting targets. The Banquet of Chestnuts, whether exaggerated or not, became the emblem of his reign. It hardly mattered what really happened that October night in 1501. What mattered was that everyone believed it. The children carried the scandal forward in their own ways. Cesare, remembered by Machiavelli as the ideal prince, lived too fast and died too young, his ambition outpacing the world around him. Giovanni, murdered in the shadows of Rome, became just another cautionary tale. Lucrezia, trapped between rumor and reality, was remembered as a poisoner when in truth she spent much of her life as a pawn, passed from alliance to alliance, a woman trying to survive in a world where her family name was both shield and curse. Geoffrey, the least remarkable, faded quietly into the background. And yet, in the imagination of Europe, they all became larger than life, wicked, cunning, decadent, the perfect villains for an age hungry for scandal. It is worth remembering that the same years which saw Rodrigo's banquets and Cesare's campaigns also saw the flowering of Renaissance art and learning. Rome glowed with frescoes, with music, with poetry. Some of that beauty was funded, directly or indirectly, by the very money Rodrigo was accused of stealing, by the very bribes and indulgences that filled his coffers. The irony of the Borgias is that their corruption coexisted with creation. The same pope accused of turning the Vatican into a brothel also helped make it a beacon of Renaissance splendor. But history prefers its stories neat. And so the Borgias were flattened into archetypes. The corrupt pope, the murderous son, the poisonous daughter. The enemies who hated them sharpened the tales. The reformers who sought to shatter Rome's power spread the stories further. Pamphlets carried their sins across Europe, whispering of incest, poison, and debauchery. Most of it was rumor, but rumor often outlives fact. Perhaps that is why the Borgias still fascinate us. They embody contradiction. They remind us that history is rarely a tale of saints and sinners, but of human beings ambitious, flawed, greedy, vulnerable. Rodrigo Borgia was both pope and father, both vicar of Christ and lover of mistresses. Cesare was both brilliant commander and reckless gambler. Lucrezia was both pawn and legend. Their lives were messy, scandalous, and human, and in that mess lies the reason we still tell their story. As the centuries passed, the Borgia name drifted into legend. Novelists, playwrights, and television producers found them irresistible. Were they really as wicked as their enemies claimed? Or were they simply convenient scapegoats, their flaws magnified into myth? The truth lies somewhere in between, blurred like the fading edges of a fresco. And so, as we drift to the end of their tale, we leave them in the dim torchlight of Renaissance Rome. Rodrigo, seated in his Vatican palace, smiling that easy Spanish smile, unbothered by scandal. Cesare, riding out in golden armor, believing himself invincible. Lucrezia, arranging flowers in her chamber, her beauty carrying both admiration and suspicion. Giovanni, sinking beneath the waters of the Tiber. Joffre, forgotten in the shadows. A family both extraordinary and tragic, remembered more for their sins than for their humanity. The Borgias remind us that power never comes without cost, that glory fades, and that scandal lingers longer than virtue. History may not be fair, but it is relentless. And tonight, as we let their story drift away into silence, we can close the doors of the Vatican Palace. Let the torches burn down to embers and leave the Borgias where they belong, half in truth, half in legend, entirely unforgettable. And so, our drift through the world of the Borgias comes to an end. We've wandered candlelit halls, watched chestnuts scatter across marble floors, and seen how one family turned the holiest palace in Europe into something closer to a stage play of ambition, appetite, and downfall. History rarely provides such perfect contrasts. Saints turning into sinners, popes behaving like princes, and families who seem less like guardians of faith and more like characters in a cautionary fable. The Borgias did not invent corruption, they did not even perfect it, but they lived it so openly, so brazenly, that centuries later their name still echoes as shorthand for decadence. Perhaps it's unfair, perhaps some of the stories are exaggerated, sharpened by enemies eager to see them fall. Yet when rumor clings longer than truth, it becomes part of history's fabric. And in the end, the Borgias became both villains and legends, forever suspended between fact and myth. So tonight, as we close the door on their story, let's leave the Vatican quiet again. The torches have gone out, the feasts are over, and the chestnuts have long since been swept away. What remains is the echo of a family who rose higher than most, fell harder than many, and left behind a tale that still drifts, soft and scandalous, through the centuries. If you've enjoyed this slow wander through history, consider dimming the lights with us again another night. Subscribe if you'd like more strange and sleepy stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Who knows? Your idea might shape our next journey through the past. For now, rest well, and let the whispers of history carry you gently into sleep.